First, I'm going to introduce Dr. Nurfadzilah Yahaya. Dr. Fadilah is, she specializes in the legal history of the Indian Ocean, as well as the Arab diaspora and its interactions with the British and Dutch colonial regimes in the 19th century. And Dr. John Solomon researches on what I'm grossly shorthanding as the Indian diaspora in Southeast Asia, and he's published a subaltern history of the Indian diaspora in Singapore. And Dr. Ho Chi Tim previously taught Singapore history at the NUS, but now he has a very interesting job as a curatorial researcher at the Malay Heritage Centre, and he's preparing for their exhibition that they're going to launch, I think, in October as part of the Bicentennial year as well. Now, this evening, we're going to, last week, Dr. Imran left us at this point with this question: was Singapore really a fishing village when Raffles arrived and signed his treaty with the Temenggong in 1819? And I think, thanks to Melody from Straits Times and her very good roundup of the lecture last week, right? I think unequivocally, by now we know that Singapore was more than a fishing village, or the impression of a fishing village. There were shipbuilding industries here, there were plantation industries here already, and there was actually a population that was quite active and interesting. And so we can probably safely, leave this question at the door. Without further ado, I'd like to invite our speakers to first give us a kind of broad overview of the research that they've done. I'd like to start with John first, maybe talking about the Indian diaspora in 19th century Singapore.
Hi, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the organizers for having us today. My research currently doesn't deal with convicts in Singapore, but I love talking about convicts in Singapore, and I hope to get there at some point to start researching it properly. So I'm going to speak to you about convict laborers today, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, thanks. Convicts, particularly Indian convicts, were sent from overseas to Singapore in the 19th century, and they were an important part of the social landscape of 19th century Singapore. So convict laborers literally laid the foundations of the 19th century port town in Singapore by quarrying stone, constructing the bricks used for building construction. They drained the swamps, they cleared the jungles, they conducted island-wide land surveys, they built many of the roads that are still around today, and of course built many of the old buildings in downtown Singapore, including, of course, St. Andrew's Cathedral. So beyond the primary role that they played in radically altering the physical environment, reshaping the physical environment of Singapore, they were also essentially a huge part of Singapore's early public services. So they cleaned the streets. During riots, they were sent out to end disturbances, like a sort of police force. They functioned as a fire brigade. They shot tigers in the jungles, killed dogs in the streets. They worked as personal servants and gardeners for private families. Some of them were cooks. And so they did many things. They were really involved in constructing the physical infrastructure of Singapore, as well as being deeply involved in the economy of early 19th century Singapore. And that is a convict story that I'm sure many of you might be familiar with. You might have already heard. Most of us recognize and remember the material contributions of convicts to 19th century Singapore. We sometimes also tend to view the penal system that allowed them to work in a very good light. So prisoners were allowed to rise through a prison hierarchy, and they acquired valuable skills, made a lasting contribution to society. They were reformed and largely reintegrated, and that's the sort of narrative we have. It's an almost celebratory story of enlightened policy with regards to crime, punishment, and reform. The first time we actually hear that kind of narrative actually is in a book by John McNair called Prisoners, Their Own Warders, which was published in 1899. So McNair was the superintendent of convicts in Singapore from the 1850s, and the book is one of our best and most vivid accounts of convict life in Singapore and how the convict system was run. And it portrays a very sympathetic view of the convicts and McNair also vigorously defends the system of convict labor. McNair's general framework for writing this history subsequently gets picked up by other 20th century writers, I think. And I would argue that we haven't really departed from McNair's story today. And I'm not suggesting that McNair was wrong or inaccurate in his descriptions, but we have to remember that McNair was defending his own legacy. So convict labor was ended in Singapore in 1873 because of intense public criticism. So we have to understand the context with which he must have written his book. Okay, and I would argue that the narrative that McNair portrays is still colors this sort of discourse we use to talk about convicts today. So I'm not going to give an exhaustive account of convict history today. Historians have done a very good job of that. Rather, I just want to suggest that we try and take a step back and try and think about convicts from a broader perspective. Let's try and contextualize convict labor in Singapore against convict labor across the British Empire, or perhaps unfree labor across the Empire. So I've got 3 questions up that we can think about. I don't have the answers, but it's just something that we can think about. So how dependent was Singapore's early 19th century development and its status as a free trade port dependent upon unfree labor or even forms of labor exploitation, if you will? And how can we think about Singapore's convict past against a broader history of penal transportation within the empire? How important was unfree or coerced labor to the project of empire, to the creation of colonies? And do these sorts of questions have any bearing on how we choose to write the history of early Singapore? So this is just a brief timeline. You can see that penal transportation within the British Empire actually lasted for 330 years, from 1615 all the way until 1945, when the British finally closed down a penal station, a prison complex in the Andaman Islands after World War II. Okay, and you can see at various points when places like Malacca and Singapore and Penang become penal settlements. Okay, so the general prisoner population in Singapore was quite varied in the 19th century and consisted of people subjected to various kinds of incarceration and punishment. These included anything from local criminals to debtors to sailors convicted of crimes and so on. But when I talk about convicts, I am specifically talking about transported convicts or transmarine convicts today. Convicts who were sentenced to serve out their time in penal stations and penal colonies overseas from their homelands, usually in the service of colonial expansion in some way. So try and understand what the sentence of transportation meant to a convicted individual. So in the perilous age of sail, before telegraph lines were laid, before steamships made oceanic travel faster, safer, and more reliable, being sentenced to transportation overseas was often seen as a one-way trip. Being transported across the ocean was not only dangerous, but when a person reached a foreign shore, they viscerally understood that their sentence was a one-way ticket from everything that they had known. It was separation from family, friends, from one's culture, from familiarity. So it was a kind of social death, if you will. A transported person would never expect to ever speak to their families or loved ones again, regardless of whether or not they had received a life sentence. The minimum sentence for transportation was 7 years, but often people just ended up staying because of the distances and how difficult it was to get back. So some penal colonies in places like Van Diemen's Land, which is Tasmania today, and Norfolk Island were especially bleak and brutal. Even though colonies like Singapore, where Indian convicts were granted many comparative freedoms, we still have records of prisoners dying of depression and homesickness. Okay, so these accounts of death by depression have to be read critically, but there are accounts that there were prisoners dying of death and depression. But sometimes the excuse of death and depression was used by colonial administrators to justify deaths. So prisoners would die for various reasons. Okay, in the mid-1850s, Singapore was the main convict station in the Strait settlements. But for a number of years, the death rate for convicts in Singapore was significantly higher proportionally than the death rate in Penang and Malacca. So much so that the government of India actually writes in to the Singapore establishment to ask what's going on. And when the Singapore establishment says it's because of depression and homesickness, the Indian government doesn't buy it. And they ask for a better explanation. But it goes to show you that convict life was not a bed of roses in Singapore. Okay, so by the time, transportation was initially seen to have a deterrent effect on crime because it was a harsh psychological and physical punishment. And it was seen as a more humane alternative to the death penalty, though. So those granted a pardon from a death sentence in Britain often had their sentences commuted to transportation overseas. And by the time transportation to Singapore was implemented as a punishment, the practice of penal transportation to foreign lands was already quite old. The Portuguese had used it since the early 1400s. The English sent convicts to the American colonies under the charge of the East India Company since 1615. So after America seceded from Britain during the American Revolutionary War of Independence, Britain's colonization of Australia began because it was fueled by the need to find a new place to leave convicts. So the British traveled to Botany Bay in Australia after failing to find a site off the west coast of Africa in present-day Namibia. So in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia in the late 1700s and in the 1800s, besides Australia, places like Penang, Malacca, Burma, Bencoolen, these all became penal settlements as well. And it was from Bencoolen that Singapore received its first convicts in 1825. So right from the get-go, transportation was tied to the expansion of empire. Prisoners were often sent to the frontiers of an expanding empire in order to help build it in the form of coerced and unfree labor. So in the 1600s, 1700s, and early 1800s, convict labor existed alongside other forms of unfree labor that fueled British imperial expansion. Indentured servitude was another form of unfree labor that existed alongside penal labor. Indentured servants would often sign contracts of service for a number of years in exchange for a paid ship passage overseas. And then there was outright slavery, of course, in the transatlantic slave trade, in which Britain played a significant role. So all of these systems were very closely interrelated, and their implementation changed according to social factors, cultural attitudes, and global economic changes as well. So one point I want to think about today is that we often link Singapore's founding to free trade and the arrival on the island of migrants seeking a better life and economic opportunity. Another way to think about Singapore's early years is perhaps to consider how predicated it was on various forms of unfree labor. And then we can think about how Singapore was a nodal point within the British Empire to further understand how British imperial expansion was fueled by these sorts of coercive labor practices. So slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833. Partially, it was due to the efforts of the Christian abolitionist movement and the growth of humanitarian values, but it was also due to large macroeconomic shifts in the global economy, a move away from mercantilism and a desire by merchants for free market access. So in Raffles, we see both of these sorts of trends. Okay, he banned slavery in Singapore, and he's been portrayed as a gentleman of the Enlightenment, okay, even though he supposedly had a large number of slaves in Java. Okay, at the same time, he's famously credited with securing the island's future by promoting free trade and not implementing trade tariffs. But since Singapore was a free port, its early administration was always chronically underfunded, which is why Farker famously allowed opium gambling and cockfighting to create government revenues through taxation. So given the cash-strapped nature of the government, unfree labor was crucial for cheap, cost-effective expansion in the settlement. Unlike slavery, transportation was seen as a morally justifiable and cost-effective way of deploying this sort of labor. So this practice starts out on an economic basis. But soon, penological theories start to develop to justify the economic imperatives behind transportation. Prison administrators argue that productive labor had a reformative effect and a redemptive effect on prisoners. So Indian convicts became the mainstay of Singapore's municipal and public works force and competed directly with free and indentured laborers coming from India, which is why in the 19th century, Singapore's Indian population was very mixed, and the largest group was South Indian Muslim traders, actually. It was only after the complete abolition of convict labor that South Indian Tamil Hindu laborers became the numerical majority and started shifting the demographic composition of the Indian community in Singapore. So I'll end by talking about the end of convict labor in Singapore, and then it's beneficial to try and, again, contextualize this within a global context. So just to set the global context, after the end of slavery, abolitionists in the UK turned their attentions to other forms of unfree labor. Indian Ocean indenture, with its harsh conditions and whippings, came under scrutiny by abolitionists. In Australia, a system evolved where convicts were assigned as personal servants to free settlers who were responsible for them. And this looked very uncomfortably like slavery as well. So in Singapore, the criticism against convict labor came primarily from the European community, who were unhappy with the freedom of convicts to move around and sully public European spaces with their presence. And they were afraid that Singapore's reputation as a penal settlement would affect their own status as residents of Singapore. So, am I over time? Okay. I think I'll just end there. But I just want to talk about how maybe I'll end by talking about how Anoma Pierce, this historian, has written an interesting chapter that compares convict workers in the 19th century to construction workers in the 20th century, whose labor is valued but whose physical bodies and presence in public spaces are not. And she talks about how they're moved to dormitories away from the public eye, and she draws comparisons with how the European community treated convict labor towards the end of Singapore's period of using penal labor. So I'll just end there. Thank you.
Okay, so labor is one of the things that the colonial government needed to put in place. And I actually thought that this was necessary to hear because, so often our image of laborers and pioneers in Singapore have to do with the dockside workers, the coolies, who also then often happen to be Chinese. And then the Samsui women who actually came much later, around the 1930s. And so, I thought that was quite important to hear from John about the early years of construction, right? Who were the ones who built the infrastructure of early Singapore? Then we come in then next to the question then, this is a new port town, it needed to be defended. Then how does then this defense evolve? The earliest Indians, when we thought about it, right, that might have landed in Singapore and came with Raffles, right, we thought actually might have been a couple of nameless sepoys who came with Raffles on the island in January 1819. But I think Fadilah then has done a lot of research then about the development of sepoy defense of the colonies, and I'm going to hand the time over to her now to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Siam. In keeping with the theme of involuntary movement, my paper examines the Sepoy mutiny in 1915 in Singapore and its aftermath from the perspective of Indian soldiers and other local authorities stationed in the British Strait settlements, Penang, Malacca, and Singapore, and the state of Johor on the Malay Peninsula embroiled also in the mutiny. Generally, the colonial gaze of the archive was directed at government and army command elite, with only occasional glances at ordinary soldiers and the police force who existed on the periphery of public record. We rarely get first-person accounts of sepoys stationed throughout the British Empire. At crisis moments, such as the mutiny, These glances intensified due to suspicion and fear. In the aftermath, information was gathered from the Sepoys by British officers, and their testimonies were recorded verbatim. 9 intercepted letters were translated and included in the report of the mutiny, thus providing us with rare insight into soldiers' consciousness, their views on imperial military service, and opinions of other colonies they were posted to. Embedded in these letters are future-oriented narratives that refer to future destinations and home, without any mention of present locations. Sepoys yearned for details of home life, write about rain besieged 2 sepoys, but offered no description about their locations, probably due to fear of censorship or because they recognized the transience of military postings, which rendered such things unnecessary. They were not there by choice, after all. Subjected to a life of circulation without mobility, sepoys were treated like commodities and cargo more than human beings. Currently, the memory of the mutiny has endured as a story of World War I waged off-stage, outside of Europe. Histories of pan-Islamic movements, part of a history of anti-imperial uprisings reminiscent of the 1857-1858 mutiny in India, anxiety about gender relations within British Empire, a rare instance of joint military strategy between various military forces, namely Russian, French, and Japanese, and finally as a landmark event that precipitated the rise of institutionalized surveillance in Singapore. Asia, Middle East, and Africa are often portrayed as a sideshow in general histories of the Great War. Likewise, the Sepoy Mutiny in 1915 is often depicted as the result of an absence of imperial strategy, a failure to recognize risk and implement measures to mitigate it. In the absence of large-scale coordination, other networks dominated in historical narratives of the Sepoy Mutiny, such as the network of radar revolutionaries stationed worldwide who exchanged knowledge about wartime networks and possible personnel shipments and was suspected of contributing to the violent outbreak in 1915. These works tend to examine the crisis from the perspective of global movements and frameworks without sufficiently considering the experiences of local military and civilian forces on their own terms. As a social history of the British Imperial Army, this paper offers a critical perspective of the Sepoy Mutiny in 1915 by paying attention to local logistical arrangements which came under scrutiny as did the inner lives of Indian soldiers. This paper takes up Lale Khalili's suggestion to yoke a macro-level analysis of socio-historical transformations, this case wrought by the Great War, with a micro-level elucidation of the effect of violence on the victims and perpetrators in a particular location, being Singapore. Michel Moyd, the historian, writes that it is crucial to look at how all men on the spot, local actors, both European and Asians, use different lenses at the same time, international, transnational, global, to see and interpret their immediate circumstances. Fortunately, the report by the Commission of Inquiry into the Sepoy Mutiny provides us with a cascade of perspectives on local military and social arrangements. British authorities stationed in the colony struggled to maintain logistical salience in the midst and wake of violent disruption. Ironically, their efficacy nearly estranged them from the metropole. Right off the bat, British authorities in India failed to constitute the Commission of Inquiry. Already disappointed by their lack of support during the mutiny itself, the governor of the Swiss settlements, Arthur Young, appointed the Inspector General of Police and 2 male civilians, the first being a banker who happens to know Hindi, and the second, a former acting Attorney General, but was forced to replace the 2 civilians with 2 military men a few days later, because this is a martial law court. The president of the commission was Brigadier General F.A. Houghton, along with members Lieutenant Colonel J.D. Ferguson and A.R. Chancellor, Inspector General of Police in the Swiss settlements, because there was no other officer in the army available. The Commission of Inquiry had 2 tasks: to collect evidence for presentation to the Summary General Court Martial, and secondly, to inquire into and report upon the direct and indirect causes of the mutiny. The stakes were high, since punishment for mutiny was death. Statements began to be taken by the newly constituted court on 17 March 1915, more than a month after the mutiny began on 15 February 1915. After 43 days of investigation and inquiry, the original detailed minutes of the mutiny was released. It ran more than 600 pages on thin tissue paper in an advanced state of decay. It most likely meant only for the eyes of colonial officials only, and for that reason it was very frank. Both the minutes and the report, adapted from the minutes, are prime examples of what we call conflict ethnography, and provided an unusually deep study of colonial studies in British Malaya and the Straits settlements during the early 20th century. The commission interviewed Sepoys, British officers, German prisoners of war, as well as other witnesses. Collectively, their testimonies tell us that the relationship between soldiers, their superiors, and prisoners of war encompassed acts of both kindness and violence, which was not surprising considering that relationships in the military were complicated because soldiers were constantly in search of patronage, protection, and community membership. Violence and guilt framed the narrative, however, and Indian soldiers came across as more defensive, most probably because they were accused of mutineering by default. So they were assumed to be guilty, unlike British officers who were interviewed, who were not assumed to be guilty during the interview. It was not a coincidence, therefore, that the published report opened with a confession of a Sepoy named Manwar to an unnamed crime. And he said, "The fault I have committed will surely mean that I shall be shot." At 7 a.m. on February 15, the morning of the mutiny, the General Commander-in-Chief, Henry Ridout, made a speech in English, which was translated into Hindustani on site by their commandant, Lieutenant General Martin. The translation, it turns out, was not altogether satisfactory or clear, or created the wrong impression. That's a quote from the report. The general officer commanding did not explicitly mention Hong Kong. They were already apprised of this beforehand. So Hong Kong was supposed to be the next destination after Singapore. Instead, he implied that Europe seemed to be an inevitable destination sometime in the future, especially when he began with, and I quote, "It is the duty of all of us to go where we are ordered, no matter what our own feelings are." The translation went on as follows: "At the same time, I hope it may soon be their luck, as in the regiment's luck, to go to Europe and fight side by side with the Indian troops against our powerful enemy. When that time comes, I am confident that they will worthily uphold the proud record of past war services from Arakan and Kandahar 1842, Burma 1885 to 1887, unquote. Speaking to Indian soldiers, Ridout crassly recalled the memory of violent subjugation elsewhere in Asia, including one on the subcontinent itself, the point of origin for the Sepoys. This move was indelicate at best and could not have done too much to boost morale. The disastrous Anglo-Afghan War of 1842 led to fatalities and severe injuries among Sepoys. Vaguely out for bloodlust, the speech fired up the rumor mill even more, and while some Sepoys started packing for the 7-day journey to Hong Kong, others became vexed and agitated after the speech. In a letter to his brother, a soldier, Zahur Ali Khan, wrote, They are telling us we are being taken to Hong Kong from here. God knows further where they are taking us to. There is no war there," unquote. On one level, the mutiny happened because soldiers simply did not believe one fundamental claim made by Ridout that they were being sent to Hong Kong, or that Hong Kong was their final destination, precisely because there was no war in Hong Kong. He continues, "We will either go to Europe, France, or Africa. We don't know to which country we will go, and we know it by our sense that we will go to Europe. Further, God knows," two soldiers wrote to their brother after the speech. The practice of hiding the true destination of military troops from soldiers was long-standing due to the presence of enemy cruisers, most notably the German raiders Emden and Geier in the region. 6 months prior to the mutiny, the 1st Battalion of the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry was suddenly informed upon embarkation that they were going to Europe from Singapore instead of India as originally announced. They ended up in France. The Sepoys already found it deeply unsettling to be kept in the dark on a regular basis about their future location, and the prospect of being lied to deepened the sense of ongoing betrayal that they were simply expected to accept for the sake of security. Their movement was driven by war, which was not even their own. As there is no faith in the life, the world is marching on, Zahur Khan complained to his brother, as if the world moved external to his own, compelling him to move with it. Theirs was a life of constant circulation without mobility. Yet another Sepoy named Sheikh Muhammad Ali wrote, "What is war? It is resurrection," as if longing for escape. On the other hand, claims of going to war in Sepoy's letters to India were complicated by their desire to stave off enlistment amongst their relatives and friends. Najaf and Munshi Khan deliberately painted a bleak picture for this purpose, and they wrote, "As this war is such that who has gone to it has never returned, all died, as if enlisted for the war will not remain alive." This is a translation. "Believe that the world has died. No one has been saved. Those who have gone to the war, all have been destroyed. And you, brothers, live in civility. And about the recruiting which is open, don't get any men enlisted at all, as all are being taken to the war. All will be caused to be killed. Don't enlist." Another Sepoy echoed this sentiment, warning his male relatives not to sign up for the army, despite promises of lucrative advancements. Munir Khan should know that he should not let Jahangir Khan go on employment in the regiment. If somebody offers money in advance even, don't let him go. This is not employment, but to sell one's life, and so on and so forth. We are already entangled. Our advice is this: it depends on you further. So without sorrow, there is nothing else in our minds, wrote one Sepoy to his brother. And he ends his letter with saying, "It is with sighing, crying, grief, and sorrow to tell you that the transfer of the regiment on the 20th February is now a settled fact. It will go to Hong Kong, but don't know this, whether it's going to the war. God knows what kinds of trouble we have to confront. Those who goes there is no hope of his returning. It is God's punishment. If God released us from this calamity, we will take it to have been reborn. We are very much confused and shocked. All the regiment is in sorrow together." So loss of life was not the only terrible consequence of war. When the army moves soldiers, they are dislocated from the social settings they know and from their existing social relations. Because Redoubt deemed the regiments too Muhammadan in composition, a quote. He wanted to have to wait for them to volunteer their service individually. This would not have helped, since their lives would not have been more decontextualized as they were deterritorialized. So I'll begin with by saying a little bit about, I will end with a little bit about my next research. So as a historian of the Indian Ocean as well as Southeast Asia, I approached the history of Malaya and Singapore from the outside, very much as part of the region as a whole. Singapore as a locale and later as country which became a British colony and now a nation state, is very much integral to both the history of the Indian Ocean and Asia as a region, both regions with undefined boundaries. For my first book project, which is currently in press, I examine Islamic law within imperial contexts. In the realm of law, especially throughout the British Empire and now the Commonwealth, links between various colonies were of course integral to the colonial legal system based on English common law. This was because legal precedents formed the basis of law to a great extent still throughout the Commonwealth. I look at the challenges and difficulties faced by the Arab diaspora to Southeast Asia from the Middle East. And like other inhabitants in the region, they certainly did not look at Singapore as being separate from the rest of the archipelago. Dutch authorities became hostile to them from the late 19th century onwards, and some sought to come to the Straits settlements, primarily Singapore, with the capital of the Straits settlements, and a mercantile hub. In my next book project, I look at environmental history specifically, history of land reclamation. The problem of territorial jurisdiction surrounding so-called new land really drives home the point that the history of Singapore as a place, just like other places, could not be isolated from the rest of the region, especially where water was concerned. As maritime boundaries constantly shifted, it is clear that the history of the island was intertwined with the rest of the region. Thank you.
I'm going to take advantage of the position of moderator, that before I go to Cheetim, because the question I'm going to ask them actually will link up to what I hope Cheetim will be speaking about today as well. What John and Fadilah have described now then seems to be, a kind of labor system that is imported rather than developed here during the colonial period. And so what do you think, what do you think the transport of penal labor and Sepoy defense say about the development of colonial infrastructures between 1819 and 1919? And I think that will tie in later with what you can talk about, a little bit about, what does that say about colonial, development of colonial infrastructures in terms of social support systems, yeah. But before that, could we hear a little bit about, from John and Fadilah, this kind of importation of labor, why was it that for, this 100 years, our labor system was predominantly imported?
You mean the actual system of labor?
Yes, I mean, from what you've described,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
It seems like, and we hear stories about how, the pioneers came and they made this home, and, so certainly along with that story, right, you would think that, if the pioneers came and made this home, then there would be some form of a labor provision and defense provision, right, that would come locally. But it seems like, for about 100 years at least, right, the bulk of that labor has been imported either by way of penal labor or, a kind of imported, moved about defense system. So what do you think that says about the development of colonial infrastructures for that 100 years?
I think it took some time to develop. I mean, when Singapore first was established, there was an urgent need to fulfill certain things like security and labor and so on, and there just wasn't enough money to do it, to employ local laborers or laborers from the region, or even labor from surrounding areas. And so, for example, with penal labor was brought in. But over the course of the 100 years, when Singapore started to develop its sort of own institutional culture, when it became a crown colony and local communities started having a sort of petitionary relationship with the government as well, that's when labor systems started to change, I think.
So for the story of imperial defense is simply because of lack of trust amongst the ruling power, the British, in trying to build up a local military corps, or in some sense, which were made up of colonial subjects. That was not on the table at this time. There were volunteer forces, which later came into being during the interwar years, and that was deemed acceptable for practical reasons, especially after what the Sepoy mutiny has demonstrated to the British. At the same time, however, there were volunteer forces amongst British civilians who were here, and they were professionals working in various jobs, doctors, dentists, merchants, and so on and so forth. And they were the ones who tried to rein in the Sepoys afterwards. They were also the target of the Sepoys, obviously, of course, which is why they did it. So, for practical reasons, lack of trust, it feeds into the story of Singapore's vulnerability in defending, not being able to defend itself. There was also the idea that because Singapore was so close to India and Hong Kong, that those forces would help. And by those forces, I mean the other Sepoys stationed in Hong Kong, in parts of India as well, would come to Singapore's aid should anything happen to Penang, Malacca, or Singapore. So there's that idea that we're plugged into this imperial network anyway. So there's no need for locally rooted forces to come into being. Yeah.
So with that, right, maybe I'll link it in to Cheetim's kind of overview of what about support structures during colonial times, and who took charge of those and how did those develop over time?
Just a quick response to because you're talking about what was needed when when the EIC first set up the settlement. You know, it wasn't a fishing village, but there was a settlement. But one I remember, because I was doing research for the Malay Heritage Center, so I was reading one of the translated versions of the Hikayat Abdullah. And one very interesting story was for the welcoming party of Fakir. So when they came in, they set up a campsite. But the next day they needed food. So where are they going to find the food? Okay, maybe the Orang Laut will go and bring the food to them. How are they going to get that food? Are they going to pay for it, or are they going to barter for it? And in fact, in the first instance, the Orang Laut stayed away from them until the Manggong ordered them to at least give them some of the fish or what. But when they want to pay the money, want to give them some currency, they didn't know what to do with it, because it was a barter system. Okay, or whatever I'm saying right here, right now, is just what Munshi Abdullah recorded in the Hikayat Abdullah. But I thought that was a very interesting example of what was needed when we go overseas and study. Some of us have gone overseas and study, or to work, or to live. Well, what are the first things that we need? A point of contact, a place to stay, a clean toilet, where to find the food. I remember the first time when I went overseas to study, right? I went to Hawaii. I thought, like Singapore, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, I still can go out and find some coffee shop. Oops, no. Everything on campus was closed, so it's a 20-minute, half an hour walk somewhere. So it's that kind of experience it helped a bit in my research when I was looking at social welfare. So my doctoral research is actually informed by my experience in working in the old Ministry Community Development Youth Sports. I was a social assistance policy officer, so I handled social assistance programs. So I worked there for 2 years with a very dedicated bunch of officers and former colleagues. So one of the questions I ended up or I left with, or kind of stuck in my mind, is if we are providing all these social assistance programs, right, providing aid, financial aid, and all sorts of social support, why is social welfare not a nice word to use, or why we don't talk about it reasonably? So that's some like a personal motivation to go into that research. So I look into how social welfare was introduced and implemented in post-war Singapore. So the primary focus was the old social welfare department, which is actually the kind of the predecessor to the ministry I work with, and now the Ministry of Social Family Development. So far from, because I work with Southeast Asianists who are very keen on bringing out the local perspectives, as some of my colleagues have said. So it's not just, I cannot just give a institutional history of how the social welfare department started, who is secretaries and head of departments, or who were the key personnel. I have also to look at the social conditions and the people they were helping. And that was a challenge in a way because this sort of information are not readily available. Even if they are in case files, they're not immediately available. So first draft I sent in, it got chucked back to me, and they say, oh, this is really boring. Not too bad, because there was a second part to it, and this is where you look at, you had to be a bit imaginative and thick-skinned, and I was aided considerably by the advancements in technology. When I started out doing research, or if I finished my bachelor's degree, when I go and do research, microfilms, you're still rolling them. Right now, I can sit at home, keyword, and it's newspaper SG, and tons of the list just comes out. It's a big, big change. It's good and bad, because good is very easy, very fast. The bad is you become, if you're not careful, it becomes very blinkered. You don't browse. Those of us that go libraries, we like to browse, right? I say I go in library to get one book, but I come up with 10 because the other books look very interesting. So the newspapers, and I would like just to talk a bit about so I was looking for information on the social conditions and the people that the social welfare department was looking out for, was helping. And it started with that, but it branched off into also a history of how civil society started up. Things like the Family Planning Association, which was actually a ground-up initiative before it was taken over after 1965 for various reasons. The Singapore Children's Society. For those of you who can access the internet now, you go and go to newspaper SG. There are a series of 4 or 5 articles, I think, published by one of the reporters in the Old Straits Times, highlighting in really heart-rending detail the problems facing children, the youth of Malaya and Singapore at that time. So disease, overcrowding, and there's one very, very difficult to read one on human trafficking. Small, I think, 10-year-old girl got sold off by their parents for social reasons or poverty reasons, and she got handed down all the way until a brothel in Singapore. But by that time, the social welfare, this was probably in the early 50s. The social welfare department came out in the 46. By that time, the social welfare department has such a presence. They knew, or at least people who wanted to help that girl knew where to go. So those were kind of my sources. Newspaper articles, which was quite different from today's articles, because last time, I think longer attention span in reading, the reports are almost verbatim. It is very descriptive compared to today, relatively. So the one other source that I looked at, and this I have to credit Mrs. Ann Wee, who was one of the founding members of the social work department, or the earlier version of it. So I looked at the research papers of the social studies diploma program. These were first-hand research accounts of social conditions in 1950s and 60s Singapore. So you get a wealth of information on kampongs, communities, economic vocations, and some of the other. There was one car. I cannot remember the Malay word. Apologize for that. But it was a group of. It was like some sort of a job looking after cars, jaga kereta. So and it's all these jobs and information that we don't see immediately today. So that was in the kind of the 20th century, going on to the 60s. The introduction of the social welfare department marked a 180-degree change in imperial policy. The points, the issues that my colleagues have brought up earlier, imported labor, imported defense, because basically Singapore wasn't a home, it was a place. It was a node in imperial networks. Okay, so people can't come to this place or any other colony to work, and not necessarily to settle. Because once you settle, you say, yes, it's the guy who's going to be responsible for the basic life contingencies, when you are out of a job, when you fall sick, who is responsible? So that's why in how our kind of current or conventional understanding of Singapore history in the 19th century is mostly how the communities help each other and how they develop. It's correct. But it's also a kind of a consequence of the colonial policy at that point in time, which is hands off. I'm not going to pay so much except to maintain the infrastructure like roads, railways, make sure that the money is flowing back to the London or the equivalent of the MNCs at that point in time. The welfare of the things that we take for granted. Today we will read things or if there's something gone wrong, right, we look to the government or we look to some elder. This is very different. So 1945 was a shift in that. It didn't happen immediately, but 1945 was a shift. So I went into the 19th century to investigate also, at least to find out how the state, and only one question, because if I'm going to go to the various, communities, the dissertation will never end. So my guiding question to go into the 19th century is, when did the colonial state or the administration started intervening, to say into like personal spaces? So one of it was, and we basically drew all the chronology all the way back to the Chinese protectorate. The Chinese protectorate, we all conventionally or popularly understand it as an institution to control the difficult secret societies. But it actually is essentially like a manpower department or manpower agency. It was essentially originally set up to protect the Sinkays, the new arrivals, the new coolie arrivals, because they were being kidnapped and trafficked in broad daylight by the secret society. So it's indirectly related to the secret societies. So that was one of the first instances of state intervention. It doesn't mean that they were going to take care of the individual, but it was a gradual process. So just to give a quick overview of it, that's why throughout the late 19th century and going into the 20th century until the war, it was still hands-off. But by the economic depression, the time of the economic depression in the 1930s, the attitude started to change already. So for the first wave of the economic depression, say the 20s and 30s, the policy was to repatriate. And I think in Singapore, the government of Singapore at that point in time, the Straits Settlements at the time had an agreement with the government of India. If you got not enough jobs, your excess labor will be repatriated back. That's for the South Asian community. The Chinese actually had no such policy. But after a while, they only broke the rule twice and repatriated groups of Chinese back twice. There was a second wave of economic depression, or at least when suddenly, poverty was rediscovered. And if all your excess labor has been repatriated, so who were the ones left complaining? It was the domicile, the settled. Those were probably born in the region, or kind of born in Singapore and have jobs here and families here, and they're not going to go home to China or to India or to elsewhere. So who is going to take care of them by then? So that was the beginning of a shift in our policy. And the war changed all of that immediately because, and this expands Singapore history slightly bigger. The change in policy happened in Africa, was started by events in Africa and the British West Indies when the economic depression led to social unrest, industrial unrest. And this was on the eve, this was during the 30s, it was at the eve of the Second World War. And by that time, the Axis powers also, or what would become the Axis powers, were also had their own empires and were competing. For the colonial British, they were looking at this, any unrest in our territories can be taken as propaganda against us. So in 1940, or 1938-39, they commissioned an inquiry. They published a report, or they finished a report that was not published until 1945 because of the implications of how the Axis power enemies might use it.
Maybe I'll just hold you there first, right? And then maybe backtrack a little bit,
Sure.
right? Because we're talking about, there was a point that you were talking about earlier that was a bit, I think, related to something that Fadilah may have done and maybe also John might have explored in your book. This notion of what about social support and welfare for those who are domiciled? Who provided those? And then not only then, John also, you looked at a really long span of, I think, Tamil migration into Singapore, briefly about how they came, but then as they settled as well, and as, the penal laborers didn't go back, right? What were the complexities that impacted, what were the complexities that impacted the giving of social support? What kind of social supports were there? As Chitim said, right, when the kind of state structured, right, or government-led structure came pretty late. So just wanted to have maybe John talk a little bit about what kinds of community help was there for the Indian community, for example, or the Tamil community. Yeah.
So like Chitim mentioned, there was very little in the way of government support initially. So it was up to the communities to sort of organize themselves and provide social support for migrants. So in terms of the Indian community, initially, once people started coming in enough numbers from the same regions and the same villages, they started setting up very small, what I would call translocal extensions of villages and village communities here. There were lots and lots of organizations with specific village names or regional names. And then the members were of the same caste, of the same kin, and so on. And then later on, this starts to expand from a translocal identity to a more diasporic identity, where people start to see themselves as Tamils overseas or as Indians overseas, in line with the nationalist movement in India or with Tamil nationalism in India as well. And then these newer organizations, which are more broad-based, start to take over the question of social reform as well as providing social support. Yeah.
And Fadilah, how about, so I think by the middle of the 19th century, because of that connection with, that shipping route opened up by the Suez Canal, I think we had more Arabs as well settling in Singapore and becoming more important as a community in Singapore. And what were then their interactions with the local community, especially in the area of the giving of support and structures?
Yeah, so it was quite complex, and the Arabs were historically have been prominent in the history of amongst Muslims in Singapore. They comprised less than 1% of the entire population, but their contributions have been highlighted way more than the other Muslim communities, and in the street settlements, and they were considered, despite lack of government support for sure, they were still considered the good colonial subjects, and their patronage of the rest of the Muslim community in the region was sanctioned by the British. So they had help from the colonial governments, and their efforts were promoted and supported in that sense, as opposed to like efforts by the South Asian communities, the various South Asian Muslim communities, and so on and so forth. So so their success in becoming patrons of Muslims in Singapore was to some extent supported by the British colonial powers. So they established endowments known as waqafs or waqfs in Arabic, and so on and so forth, which consisted of hospitals, schools, medical dispensaries, cemeteries, and so on and so forth. So they established all these things, and about more than 90% of endowments established by Muslims in Singapore was established by them. The rest were established by South Asian Muslims, usually from the north, not Tamil, but from the northern part of India, like Koja Muslims, for example, and so on and so forth. And about half of these endowments are still around. It was, the relationship is not altogether hunky-dory. There's a lot of tension amongst the various communities. One might say that the Arab prominence was actually at the expense of the local indigenous Malays to some extent. Yeah.
I think before I open then up to the floor for questions, right, I think what I'm getting from that this very quick kind of exchange is that when we talk about colonial history, then a lot of the information that we know about what was built and what was established, what we learn from the books appear to suggest that it was colonial infrastructures. But I think based on what we're hearing today, it appears that a lot of the building also, a lot of the setting up of Singapore itself came from people who were migrant and very fluid, coming in and out. So my two-parter would be, right, at what point really did it change? And then the second one is, right, what does this, how does this impact on how we write and research history for the way forward? What kind of directions do we go to look for sources to write our histories?
Do you mean at what point did the way we write history change, or?
That would be a further part of the question, but I think, okay, at what point did, so the first part of the question is, what we're seeing is, right, the description of a very fluid 19th century, where even your laborers, your social support, right, these things don't seem to be anchored in anything. They're brought by migrants, but these migrants might go, but they're not anchored down by a kind of government structure. And yet, at the same time, right, what we have been taught so far, right, it seems to always tell us about the importance of that colonial administration. So the first question was, at what point did our infrastructure become less fluid and really become more kind of centralized? So that was the first question. Maybe we take that first.
Yeah. So I think I'll take the third thing, the third way that you can phrase the question. I think it's because I think it's always been fluid and not really centralized, and it was less formal as a result, always. And people didn't necessarily go to whoever, their religious affinity, their ethnic or religious affinity did not decide who they go to. So there are certain labels like the Chinese protectorate, for example, misleadingly leads a lot of people, including scholars, to think that they only had purview over the Chinese communities, when in fact the Chinese protectorate had purview over the entire colony, all colonial subjects in the Straits settlements who were not European. So the Chinese protectorate had purview of everybody, basically, over everyone, and were concerned with everyone. And so all these striations into ethnic contributions or religious contributions have kind of skewed Singapore history to become, the only unifying government that we can identify for the entire colony. It seems to be the colonial government. So I think that's why there's more emphasis on colonial infrastructure, and we tend to overemphasize the centralization of colonial welfare and so on and so forth. Colonial bureaucracies, we tend to overemphasize it because it's the one thing that unites the story of everyone in Singapore. So it's very much the way that we write history. So that's why I thought we should start with that third framing that you suggested in your question. Yeah.
I agree. No, but maybe just to different, a quick point. The Chinese protectorate definitely, I think, the protectors of the Chinese, or the Taichins, as they were called in time, at that point in time, were the majority of the population was in Singapore was Chinese, but they definitely didn't restrict by ethnicity. But I think from the bureaucratic point of mind, there was a nice divide. But it wasn't in reality, just on paper, that the Chinese protectorate checked out the Chinese, and actually the South Asian community, there was a labor department set up for it, or at least because they were actually going according to the functions. But the first question you had is when it look a bit more centralized, and I'd like to try that, and also to kind of clarify what I was kind of rambling on about earlier. When I talk about the British introducing social welfare, for the record, I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just stating what happened. Okay, and when they tried, and all the fluid, different social support infrastructures that we have discussed earlier, right? The British Social Welfare Department did not try to supersede them. It really saw themselves as part of an overall structure. But yes, ideally, with them making the last decisions, of course. But so if just a quick answer to that question, when did it start changing? I would say from 45, because the British came back to their colonies, not just Singapore and Malaya, with a different idea of how to present their post-war empire. Yeah. So it became actually the kind of a very rudimentary nation building started from there.
Yeah, just to, perhaps you mentioned that in the 19th century it was very fluid, and when did that start to change? So I'll just address the question from the perspective of identity, maybe. So I think there were rooted identities to Malaya, but they were always, in the 1920s, 1930s, they were mostly expressed as imperial identities, the idea of imperial citizenship. So you were a citizen of the empire, you were a subject of the empire, your relationship was a personal relationship with a sovereign as opposed to territory. And that starts to shift, like Chitim said, after 45, when decolonization meant people had to make choices. You couldn't have double citizenships, for example. You had to make hard choices about nationality and citizenship. There's this whole new architecture of passports and borders and so on. And that made people make what often were very pragmatic decisions rather than emotional decisions. And then the national identity came afterwards, I think. That's Karaoke-san, right? I haven't finished reading it yet. With regards to the Indian community, initially, at first, in the late 19th century at least, it was very male-dominated, and that started to change. And a lot of that was because of official British policy to get more women in. The women were seen as a stabilizing factor, and they tried to create, for example, in plantations in Malaya, plantations were isolated, sealed off communities unto themselves. So they tried to create family structures and facilitate the creation of family structures in these plantations. So women started coming in increasing numbers, I think from around the 1920s onwards, and then they started to develop more gender parity in terms of numbers, not in terms of pay. Women would do the same jobs on the plantations, but they would be paid a fraction of what men would be paid.
It's extremely difficult to find out who came as a wife, because being a wife is a legal category, and the British, because this was a British colony, so you're subjected to English common law definition of who a wife was. And almost all the major communities who came to Singapore and already based in the region had polygamous cultures. The Chinese, the Malays, the Indians, and so on. And so they might have come as, with their understanding that they are married to someone, but the British would only count the first wife or the oldest wife as the real wife. So it's extremely difficult to manage to count who was married to who, legally speaking, amongst colonial subjects. Yeah, but they get good numbers for the European population, for sure. Yeah.
I will probably only just say the demographics, the population became a little more balanced from the 30s onwards. I think partly in reaction, I must apologize, I cannot remember exactly the reason right now, but I think it's also partly a reaction to the economic depression and the population imbalance. Essentially that's all.
I'll have to get back to you on that. I think all up between the late 1700s and up until 1945, about 100,000 Indians were sent out as penal convicts. So at any given time in Singapore, from the years like, for example, in the 50s, there would have been maybe 2,000, or maybe even upwards of 3,000 convicts. I'm not sure what the total population, Indian population size would have been at the time. But in terms of the laboring population, it was quite low up until the 1880s when it became much.
Yeah, good question.
This is a lot of money, right?
Not actually, no. Because I should expand on it a bit more. But okay, for a direct response first, I don't know. But it's definitely not of the municipal council. I think this was the overall government of Singapore. I think from 46 is the colonial Singapore. So, and the budget is shared. Whatever budget will be shared among, because this is when the British started introducing, as part of their very rudimentary nation building exercise, right, to introduce education, for free education actually at primary schools, increase healthcare, and more protection for the manpower. So this is part of a broader prong approach actually to because they believe, partly is following what was happening back in the metropole. The Labour government took over, but actually way before that, there was really ferment or at least agitation for change, to make everything, remake society and make it more equal. So that was just part of the thinking at that point in time, and it also influenced the colonial office. Yeah. So for the budget, sorry, that one I only can tell you is part of the overall government of Singapore. So it's separate from the municipal. Yeah. Actually, I see mine as more as a very local approach going out to the global. What my research is actually, one of the points I wanted to make, actually in response to Xiang's and also what Fadilah brought earlier about how we write Singapore history, right? Part of it is very influenced by what happened after 1965, the issues and the concerns. So what I thought I could try, hopefully, as to build on, is how you write a history from a very individual point of view first. What is needed when you, at least from first of all from a migrant point of view, what is needed when you come to a foreign land, and then what are who do you look to, who are the agencies you look to, do you look to the government or do you look to your community? Now the blind spot to that is what happened to the people in the area before. And this is where, you know, reading local Malay sources are extremely, extremely important. So when I read the Hikayat Abdullah, you know, those examples, the example I gave earlier about how, you know, there was kind of a miscommunication between how you use money, you know, when they were used to a barter trade economy instead. So what happened to those existing systems when this new system came in place? I'm going to put down roads, I'm going to have laws, I'm going to, you know, change. What happened to those systems and societies? So for that, to kind of address that blind spot, we have to look at like Malay World and Maritime Southeast Asian District. Actually, a bit of, for those of you who came to Imran's talk the last week, that would be quite useful, yes.
In my own research, because I look at diaspora and mobility, my blind spot is also the same, in that the people who remain, the people who were here before 1819, tend to fall out of the picture. And these people who came from abroad, you know, because you only notice something, you tend to notice something when they move. So, you know, historians tend to study people who are on the move, who were on the move, always moving, always doing something. And so, you know, they're overrepresented in historical sources, in the historical record, yeah. And so the people who tend to fall out of the frame would be the local people, the people who were already in Southeast Asia. In Singapore, it would be the people who, like the Malays, for example, and so on and so forth. So there would be that's why, you know, in my next, that's why I look at I started to become more interested in things that were moving but involuntarily. So it could be, you could stay in the same spot and you could still be mobile in the sense that, you know, you could be someone who's been rooted here forever, but suddenly you're foreign. You're a foreigner, and that happened, for example, in the Netherlands Indies, when the Chinese and the Arabs were suddenly became foreign, you know, even though they had been here for so long, for centuries, whereas the Javanese were considered local. So you could move even though you are not moving literally, for example. So that's a blind spot. People who are not moving, and so on and so forth, tend to not be noticed by scholars. Yeah.
Hi, Sandy. Yeah. So I guess when you're looking away from the local context and you're looking at sort of an empire-wide context, you're looking for comparisons. You're looking for continuities, and you're trying to make sense of the big. What connects it all? When we talk about empire, what connects it all? What connects a phenomenon like penal transportation across vastly different parts of the empire? So you're thinking about the driving forces of change in empire. It's very out of vogue to think about of individuals, great white men driving change, but they are still important as well. Individuals are important in history. So are big economic structural forces. So are local forces. You have to try and find the Goldilocks zone between understanding how local forces interact with large structural changes across the globe. And you also have to think about how people at the very bottom of society also impact and make historical change as well. So when you take too much of a global approach without looking at the specificities that exist on the local approach, then that could be a blind spot, I think. Well, first, we as far as possible, we try and look at non-English sources now, on top of English sources. I mean, the colonial sources, of course, they matter. But as far as possible, when you're looking at specific communities, you know, we try and look at non-English sources. And there's been a trend since the 80s in Singapore in scholarship to try and recover people's voices from below, right? So there were a few works that have done that in scholarship, and that sort of emphasis has gone to the museums as well. If you go to the National Museum, there's a big emphasis on social history, you know, and oral history. So obviously we don't have oral histories from the 19th century, but as far as possible, we try and recover the experiences of ordinary people, whether that's through colonial records or things like that. So.
I agree with John, and in that we should look at basically non-English sources, non-European sources, and that's what I think our generation of historians are doing more and more, and to acquire the linguistic capability and all this, to broaden. For example, because I'm looking at the Arab diaspora, so I had to read sources in Arabic as well, alongside Malay and so on and so forth. So it broadens our repertoire of sources. It brings us away from the colonial record. But there's also a lot to be said about reading the colonial record against the grain, of course. So, you could read the sources like in that way. There's also, the colonial sources are also being released continually over the years. The FCO records on Malaya in Singapore have been released slowly by the National Archives in London since 2012. So, even that story, even that record is expanding in complicated ways. Because these are usually the more complicated records that are released late. So that's one thing for us to do, to include the voices of the colonial subjects themselves in those languages that they themselves spoke in and wrote in.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely for Singapore history, English is important, but if you want to get to what people were doing at that point in the 19th century and even the earlier 20th century, I think, I really hope, I think in the near future that any history program would have at least pumped some resources in for language training, because I don't think that's really a priority right now. So for sources, based on my research, is because one of the tendencies, and actually this is a blind spot, because we move with trends and we want to look at local sources, we want to recover lost voices and all this, we tend to dismiss existing sources. All the sources I use for my dissertation are all sources that have been there for a long, long time. It's just that I went in and asked different questions of it. And I had a good supervisor and a good encouraging committee to, basically let me have free rein. But it's basically, those are old sources, but I asked new questions about it. So when I was teaching at NUS, when I supervised students like Sandy over there, you just encourage them to ask new questions, because each generation of student will have different questions. They have their own life experiences, and they will ask different questions of the sources. And that's one part. The other part is, I think, the current and existing call of historians also contribute to the archive accumulation of sources. So, for instance, what Lalo Kasing does in his books or his work, he accumulates lots of oral interviews, which are necessary. Another historian and all, Kevin Blackburn, he's teaching at NIE. He makes his students, as class assignments, go and do oral interviews, and those are recorded. So, academia can play a big role in this expanding our archive. So it's not just the library or the National Archives instead.